Like I said earlier, man, we are in week 4 of our summer series called The Story of Moses. My name is Jason. I'm the community outreach pastor here at Foundation. If I've not met you, I would love to meet you outside after the gathering. Sometimes on Sunday morning, I'm like running like crazy. So it's weird for me to actually be kind of moving in like a 8-foot space during the gathering. I'm typically moving in a 18,000 square foot space during the gathering, but it's great to be here with you guys today. Last week, we talked about an incredible story in the Old Testament. We talked about Moses and his calling story with the burning bush. And I don't know about you guys, but if I saw a bush on fire talking to me and not burning up, that would probably be enough for me to go, okay, I'll do what you want me to do. I will literally run through walls for you, God. But that's not what Moses did. Moses then asked for a couple more miracles and a couple more signs and all of those things. But that's a huge story in the Old Testament. In fact, it's one of those stories where you're like, is that true? Did a bush really burn up but not burn up and a voice come? Like, did that really happen? Like, I remember when I was a kid, I had the opportunity to take my 14-year-old son, Caleb, back through some of the spaces that I grew up in, some neighborhoods, some ball fields, and that kind of thing. We had that opportunity recently. And when I was a kid, I just remember those spaces being like larger than life. And then we drove past them, and he's like, that's it? And so I think sometimes we do that with the Bible, right? So sometimes we do that with stories. Sometimes we do that with places. Sometimes we look at it and go, man, that maybe I'm treating this a little bit bigger than it actually is. And then we have some stories where we're like, I don't know, maybe this didn't happen, right? I was a kid that was in church whenever the doors were open. I don't know if that's you. Sometimes I'm like, man, I'm happy that it was that way. But then other times I'm like, I'm the church kid that has to get like rewired sometimes to deal with like normal things and normal people and normal issues, right? But I remember all of these stories on the pages of the Old Testament. And so I just got the luck of the draw this week in our journey through the story of Moses to deal with one of those stories that I really didn't believe when I was an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, if I'm being really honest with you. Did these things really actually happen? Why did they happen? What do they mean? Did this really actually take place? There's some stories in the Old Testament for me that are just like mind-boggling. And this particular passage of Scripture, there is evidence outside of the Bible that, kind of clarifies the fact and corroborates what actually happens on the pages of the Scriptures. That these stories are true. These are things that actually happened historically. And when I figured that out this week, it just kind of blew my mind. I don't know if you've ever been in that spot, but we've talked about the historical authenticity and accuracy of the Bible. And these stories actually happened. These stories actually happened, and they're crazy, yes, probably insane for sure, but true, yes. We're in week 4, like I said, of our summer series, and we're walking through the story of Moses. And if you were here with us last week when Clint talked about the story of the burning bush, we heard one major truth that we pulled out of that message, and it's this. The greatest movements in our life require 2 things: a call by God and the faith to answer that call. Last week, Clint had a phone up here on stage, and it actually rang. That was kind of crazy. I thought about taking the object lesson a step further with the content that we have to do today, but nobody would probably come back to church ever again because this stuff is pretty intense. But the story of Moses, the burning bush, is a calling story. And the rest of the story of Moses, we see his faith play out in real time. We see the growth of Moses and by extension Aaron and the rest of the Israelites, and we see this back and forth. And it's just back and forth. The rest of Moses' life, I would argue, is Moses not only responding to the call of God, but having the faith to continually answer that call. Like, it's one thing to pick up the phone the first time, but to pick up the phone every single day, that's intense. That requires all sort of growth inside of us to be able to do that. I want us to sit in this for a minute today as we walk through this passage. And we will begin to see the heart of God in the story of Moses. We will see the purpose of Jesus in the story of Moses. Remember, we said a couple weeks ago that the better we understand the story of Moses, the better we will understand the purpose of Jesus. Now, today we're going to pick up the story of Moses in chapter 5 of the book of Exodus. And we're going to start in chapter 5, and I'm going to drop you off in the middle of chapter 12. Okay, so that's why I said it could go 2 hours. It's not going to go 2 hours. I've already done it once. It went about 40, so you're good. Went about 40 minutes. But we're going to start in chapter 5. And in chapter 5 and chapter 6, there's some really important backstory that we have to know before we get to the meat of what we're going to talk about today. Exodus 5, 1 through 5 says this. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." So this is after the burning bush, after Moses goes back to the elders of Israel, after Moses goes and talks to his brother, and he's like, dude, I just got you into this. You're going to talk for me. What am I going to talk about? I don't know. God will tell you. So they're going through all of this. And then they get through that conversation, and then they go talk to Pharaoh. And there's all of this tension here. So in verse 2, Pharaoh responds this way. "Who is the Lord? And why should I obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or the sword." Verse 4, "But the king of Egypt said, 'Moses and Aaron, why are you taking people away from their labor? Get back to your work.'" Verse 5, "Then Pharaoh said, 'Look, the people of the land are now numerous.'" We've been talking about that. That's a theme the last 4 weeks. There's a bunch of people. There's a bunch of Israelites. And you want to stop them from working. Now, the rest of chapter 5 is this precursor to the plagues of Egypt. Here's what's happening. The Israelites are slaves, and they're required a quota per day of making a certain amount of bricks. And there's a couple of components or ingredients that they have to make these bricks. And so what Pharaoh does in chapter 5 is he said, hey, we used to bring you the straw for the bricks, but we're not going to bring you that straw anymore. And you got the same amount of time and the same quota that you've got to make, and you have to go find the straw. They were enraged about this, but the slave handlers and the rest of the oppressors pressed down on them even further. Moses goes back to God and says, dude, ever since I've been home, this has been a problem. Like literally everything you have told me to do has not worked out. It has been difficult for the Israelites. This is not what I signed up for. God answers Moses back in the beginning of Exodus chapter 6. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of this country." Verse 2, God also said to Moses, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by the name, the Lord, I did not make myself fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they resided as foreigners. Moreover, verse 5, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out. I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and mighty acts of judgment. Verse 7. This will be on the screen. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Now, I've always struggled with this passage. God's saying he's got a group of people. God has selected a group of people. They are his people. But what about everybody else? What about everybody else? That's a question that I've sat in all week with this passage. What about the Egyptians? God has his people. And I've told people this before, it's that God has his people. They're like, number one. And then right under that, everybody else is like 1A. He loves his people. In fact, we know he sent Jesus because he loves everyone. But this is an example, this is a narrative, this is a story, this is real life of how God chose his people and he pushed them out of slavery. And this is a major scene for the people of God in the Old Testament. We're going to walk into an incredible movement of what God would do for his people. And we're going to move quick. I promise we're going to go through 10 plagues and the Passover, and we'll actually not take 2 hours. But I would like to challenge you today to read these chapters for yourself sometime this week. I read these chapters multiple times this week in one sitting, and it took me about 10 to 15 minutes. And I'm a slow processor and a little bit slow reader. So it takes me some time to ingest it. So you can listen to it on your phone. You can pull it out during the week, but read it in its entirety. There are two major things that are happening in these chapters. There are the actual plagues of Egypt that are absolutely crazy, right? There's the actual plagues of Egypt and what is happening because of them. And then there's this interplay that's going on between Moses and Aaron as the speakers for God and Pharaoh. So there's this battle going back and forth kind of between Pharaoh and God. It's kind of a contest to see who's the biggest and baddest. And so we see this idea of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart over and over and over again. So we got to talk about it. Every time that the words are mentioned, there's some things going on in the original language that I think we need to understand. In the ancient culture, the heart was the core of your being. The heart was the seat of intellect and emotion. It was what you were. If you had a good heart, you were a good person. If you had a bad heart, you were a bad person. Not like a defective, pumping blood muscle, but the core of who you were. I found this quote this week that I thought was incredible, and it was actually in like a medical journal. It was weird. I don't know why I was reading a medical journal. But they said it this way: the heart was regarded in ancient Egypt as the organic motor of the body. It was the seat of intelligence, an important religious and spiritual symbol. In this back and forth, we see a couple of Hebrew words that are used to describe this process of hardening of the heart. And if you look at the Hebrew words in detail, these Hebrew words have like a positive connotation and a negative connotation. And every time these words are used in this passage towards Pharaoh, they have a negative connotation. So basically what it means when you see the phrase hardening of heart, that either Pharaoh is hardening his heart or God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. And that means that he's become stubborn or obstinate. Think about like a 3-year-old toddler that doesn't want to do what you want them to do. That's Pharaoh. He's just older, stronger, more powerful, probably the most powerful human on the planet at that time. But that's the action that we have going on in these words. Pharaoh's heart, to use today's terms, was growing more numb by the day. And this hits all of us. I would like to think that there's been times for each of us that your heart has probably been hardened. I know mine has, but we'll get to that later. Exodus 7, verse 3, we're going to jump right in. This is God speaking. He says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. He's talking to Moses and Aaron. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment, I will bring out my divisions, my people, the Israelites. Exodus 7:13. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord said. The first plague was the plague of blood. And we see the recounting of that in Exodus 7:14 through 25. And in this scene, Aaron stretches out the staff over the Nile, and all of the water in the Nile turns to actual blood. And it's not just all of the water in the Nile, it's all of the waterways that run into the Nile. And those of you that understand and know maybe this ancient culture, the Nile was and probably still is the life of Egypt. So God attacks the Nile first. The Bible tells us that people begin to dig trenches around the Nile to find suitable drinking water to make life happen. We also see that Pharaoh has magicians in this narrative. And some people think that these magicians are like prophets of the Egyptian gods, okay? So we start to see all of these other people involved. Exodus 7:22. But the Egyptian magicians did the same thing by their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Second plague, the plague of frogs, right? I don't know how we jump from blood to frogs, but the Bible talks about how Egypt was just overrun with frogs. Like one frog is cute, 2 frogs is 3 or 4 frogs is a problem, right? But they are overrun with frogs. Pharaoh was told that frogs would come up to the palace, all the way up onto his bed, and that frogs would cover the home of every one of his people and officials. Then the frogs would die in those houses and in those spots. Dead frogs were everywhere. And then Exodus 8:15. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, that there weren't more frogs coming, he hardens his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Third plague, the plague of gnats. This basically was like, hey, Aaron's going to throw dust into the air, and then all of that dust becomes gnats. And I don't have to explain to you how awful gnats are. If you've driven below Macon before, you know, right? This is crazy. So blood, 7 days later, frogs, and then it's like, all right, well, he's not listening to the frog thing. I thought I would get him with that. And then there's gnats. Exodus 8:19, right after the 3 verses that we have about gnats in the Old Testament. The magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen, just as the Lord would said. The 4th plague, the plague of flies, happens in Exodus 8:20 through 32. God told Moses that this was the plague where things would start to kind of separate, right? So everything that he did to the Egyptians, before this, he was doing to the Israelites. But now it was like, I'm going to divide my people, right? Swarms of flies plagued the land, but they did not go into Goshen, which we've talked about over the last couple weeks, which was the land or the area that the Israelites were given inside of Egypt. Swarms of flies. I am not making this up. I had 2 flies around my desk on Wednesday when I was trying to prep for the message, and I just had to get up and go do something else. That was 2, not like swarms. I don't know how many is in a swarm, but you get the idea. This is huge. The next plague, actually the next passage, Exodus 8:32. But this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. The 5th plague, the plague of livestock, Exodus 9:1 through 7. All the livestock that belonged to the Egyptians died. All of them. Not like nothing was left. And it's an agrarian society, and livestock was really important. So he's hit them in the Nile, and he's hit them with the livestock. Exodus 9:7. Pharaoh sent men to investigate and found out that not even one of the animals the Israelites had died. Yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go. 6th plague is the plague of boils. Exodus 9:8 through 12. Now, if I made it this far as Pharaoh, this is where I'll probably bow out. I did Google it a little bit this week, because I've never had a boil, but if everybody in the room had like one boil, then nobody would come to church ever again, right? If you got the boil from being here, you probably never see Foundation's doors again. That'd be kind of weird. But this was like every person, every animal that I guess wasn't affected by the livestock dying, boils all over their body. This is kind of like Job in the early stages of the book of Job, but for tons and tons and tons of people. That's how intense this is. Exodus 9, verse 12. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. There's so much more to get into with that one, but we're going to keep going. The 7th plague is the plague of hail. Exodus 9:13 through 35. Exodus 9:24 and 25 and 26 give us some interesting information. They say that it was the worst storm in the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. The only place that it did not hail was in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Exodus 9:34 and 35. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. The 8th plague is the plague of locust. Exodus 10:1 through 20. So what happens here is like after the storm, whatever was left was eaten by the locust. Swarms of locusts literally covering the ground. All the vegetation was gone after the storm. Exodus 10, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these signs of mine among them." Exodus 10, verse 20. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. Plague 9, the plague of darkness. Exodus 10, 21 through 29. The Bible tells us that a thick darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. I don't know what a thick darkness is, but I was thinking about this week, like, man, I wonder if I could get like Christian to turn off all the lights in here so it'd be kind of dark, but then everybody would like do that little screaming thing like the kids do, and then everybody would probably never come back again, so I decided not to do that. I don't know what a thick darkness is. I don't know what the Bible is trying to describe here, but the Bible said that no one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. For some of us, that would be incredibly difficult. I can't imagine. Exodus 10, 27 and 28, though, says this. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. Pharaoh said to Moses, "Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die." So we see in the first 5 plagues that Pharaoh was kind of hardening his own heart. And we see a few times in the last few plagues where God was hardening Pharaoh's heart. So God gave him a little bit of a shot for his heart not to be hard, not to be callous, not to be numb, not to be obstinate or a little 3-year-old baby or whatever. He gave him a little bit of a shot, and then God hardened his heart. The 10th plague is the plague of the firstborn. It's also the scene where we get what has become known as the Passover. So I want to read these words to you. In Exodus 11 and 12, everything has built to this. Everything has built to this moment. I'm going to pick up in verse 1 of chapter 11. Now the Lord had said to Moses, "I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from there. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask for articles of silver and gold from their neighbors. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed to the Israelites, and Moses was highly regarded." Listen to this. Moses was highly regarded by Egyptian officials in Pharaoh's house and by the people. So at this juncture, everybody was behind Moses except Pharaoh. Everybody had seen what God was doing. And even the people with Pharaoh were like, "Man, you're good. Take your people. Go home." So Moses said, this is what the Lord said, verse 4. "About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill. All of the firstborn cattle will die as well. And there will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been and worse than there will ever be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All of these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, 'Go, you and all the people who follow you. And after that, I will leave." Then Moses, hot with anger, left that encounter with Pharaoh. Exodus 11, 9 and 10. The Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh will refuse to listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in Egypt." Moses and Aaron performed all of these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go out of his country. Exodus 12. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month for you is to be the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel, bring them all together, that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed to feed everyone." Verse 5. "The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, where all of the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides of the door and the top of the door of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire. Do not leave it until morning. If some of it is left until morning, you have to burn it. This is how you are to eat it. You are to eat it with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. This is the Lord's Passover. Hurry up. Be ready to go, because it's about to happen. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." And God follows through with this plague. You can read the rest of it. Israel is spared, and Pharaoh releases God's people. Moses and Aaron, Moses, the guy that didn't want to take the phone call, Moses, the guy that just needed more of a miracle at the bush than just a talking bush that's not burning. That guy, Moses, and his brother, who Moses was like, "Dude, somebody's got to talk for me." Moses and Aaron are the people that God uses to make all of this happen. And this has been commemorated through the Passover ritual with the Jewish people in their community for thousands of years. You know, as I have sat this week in this part of the narrative, I have been struck just by how many ways this applies to us. I'm going to try to narrow it down in the next few minutes. There's three big pieces that challenged me in this. The first one is this. You probably caught it. But the Israelites and the Egyptians are kind of operating on this level, right? And then there's like the officials and the magicians and Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh, right, are on this other level. And God's working faithfully on both. He's caring for his people. Like, he couldn't even get through all the plagues on his people. He had to separate the plagues. But God is in the midst of this. And I tried to spend equal time on each thing, but the condition of Pharaoh's heart is way more important than the craziness of the 10 plagues. It's incredible, this back and forth. How much time is spent in the front half of the book of Exodus on the condition of one man's heart. That tells me that God is about our hearts and that God is about the condition of our hearts, right? We talked about a couple weeks ago that understanding the story of Moses would better help us understand the purpose of Jesus. This is where that starts. So here's how it works now. We don't have the boils, we don't have the flies, we don't have the gnats, we don't have that stuff. But we have those things that we struggle with every single day. And God is in the midst of the struggle. And as you sit here this morning, whether you're a person that's giving God a chance for the first time or the first time in a long time, or somebody that's been following Jesus for a long time, this applies to each of us. Do you have a heart that's hard towards God? I hate even asking that question, but do you have a heart that's hard towards God? I have a heart that is hard towards God sometimes. I'm stubborn. I'm obstinate. I'm a cranky 3-year-old. So how do we change that? Because a person, whenever we have a hardened heart, we do not recognize the spiritual realities around us. When we have a hardened heart, we don't recognize the spiritual realities around us. But God doesn't quit on us. He continues to pursue. How do we begin to recognize these realities? If my heart is hard right now, how do I recognize those realities around me? I think there's a few things. The first thing is connection. Connection with other people. And if you have a hard heart right now, it's the connection with other people, the connection with God's people. Just sitting across the table from somebody and just listening will begin to soften your heart. The second thing there is community. Like not just the one-on-one connection, but the bigger group connection like we do here every Sunday. Meeting in people's homes like we do during the year. Hanging out with people. Being in community. But it's being in community with the right people. Because when we're hard and we're in the community with wrong people, it just pushes us like Pharaoh. We saw that with his officials, right? They were right there behind him. Their hearts were hard. And so Pharaoh kept walking down that track. The third thing is serving. When I serve, I am more like Jesus. And when I serve, my heart is soft and pliable and ready to be moved by Jesus. I don't know what that's like for you, but this past week, I got to help pack 600 and something lunches for kids in our community that need it. Soft versus hard. And when we do that, our hearts begin to soften. But we have to be careful that they don't become hard again. And that's why so much emphasis is placed on the condition of our heart in the scriptures. Proverbs 4:23 says this, above all else, guard your heart. Because what? Everything you do flows from it. And the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Israelites agreed on this. The last thing is this. As a community of people, God drew the Israelites out of Egypt so he could continue to pursue them as his people. And we're going to continue to see that over the course of the rest of the summer. God pulls his people out so that he can draw them in. God draws us out of the bondage, of the anxiety, of the slavery, of the struggles, of the sin, of the hard heart. God draws us out so he can draw us back in. God desires today to bring you even closer to him than you are now. And there's a lot of steps to get there. And it's not an easy, one sequential kind of linear path. It's not. But that's where we leave the story of Moses. But the Passover reminds us of so much. But to me, it most reminds us of how God cares about the condition of our heart.